He called it an abomination. He stood in the pulpit, his voice thundering through the church, telling his congregation that a man who lays with another is unworthy of God's kingdom. He called it a sin against nature, something that would bring fire and wrath upon the world. But when the doors closed and the sermons ended, he was the very thing he condemned. A gay man. A pastor. A husband. A father. But what happens when the man leading the prayers is living the very sin he condemns? On July 9, 2023, 3 bodies were found inside his home. His mother. His wife. His cousin. And the man who had spent his life preaching salvation. He was nowhere to be found. Welcome to Sean Mayfield was a man who understood the weight of expectations from the moment he was old enough to speak. Raised in a strict Baptist household in Jacksonville, Florida, he had been taught that faith was not just a belief, it was a way of life. His mother, Regina Mayfield, instilled discipline and obedience. His father, Deacon Luther Mayfield, believed in the unshakable authority of Scripture. Their home was one where sin had no place, and tradition ruled without question. From a young age, Omari understood what was expected of him: grow into a God-fearing black man, marry a respectable woman, and one day lead a congregation of his own. But behind the forced smiles, the carefully rehearsed prayers, and the fire and brimstone sermons, Omari carried a secret that could destroy everything. Being a gay black man in the church was not an option. It was an abomination, a curse, an unspeakable shame. By his late 30s, he had crafted the perfect illusion. He had moved to Houston, Texas, where he became the head pastor of New Bethel Baptist Church, an influential ministry with over 2,000 members. His sermons were broadcasted on local television, and his community saw him as a pillar of faith and morality. He was married to Imani Mayfield for 10 years, a devoted wife who stood by his side. They had a 7-year-old son, a home in an upper-class suburban neighborhood, and a reputation of unquestionable integrity. For outsiders, his life was untouchable. But inside, he was suffocating. Omari understood one thing above all: his reputation was everything. He protected it fiercely, more than his family, more than his congregation, more than his own happiness. He had no tolerance for disobedience, and he had no patience for anyone who threatened the perfect image he had built. Not even his own blood. But blood was exactly where his secret began. Tyreek Simmons was 27 years old, younger than Omari by a decade, but their lives had been intertwined from birth. Tyreek was the son of Regina Mayfield's younger sister, making him Omari's first cousin by blood. Unlike Omari, Tyreek was not burdened by the same fears. He had grown up in a different kind of household, less strict, less traditional. He was bold, outspoken, and unapologetically bisexual. Where Omari fought every urge to hide his truth, Tyreek embraced his desires openly. He never hid who he was. And that was a problem. Omari and Tyreek had been inseparable as children. Holidays, church gatherings, and Sunday dinners, their families were tightly connected. But as they grew older, they drifted apart. By the time Tyreek reached adulthood, their relationship had shifted. He had no patience for his cousin's self-righteous sermons. He saw Omari for what he truly was: a hypocrite, a man who preached against the very things he secretly longed for. And Omari saw Tyreek as a temptation he couldn't escape. The summer of 2017. A family reunion in Atlanta, Georgia. It started the way these reunions always did: a backyard barbecue, old gospel records playing from a stereo, laughter, stories of the past. That night, after the younger family members gathered around a bonfire, a few drinks turned into many. As the conversation turned personal, Tyreek made a confession that changed everything. "You know, I've always looked up to you, Omari." "Man, I was the one looking up to you," Omari replied with a laugh, taking another sip from his beer. But then Tyreek leaned in closer, his voice lower, his words deliberate. "I don't just mean like that." Omari froze. Tyreek continued, his eyes never leaving his cousin's. "I know who you are. I know what you feel, even if you won't say it. We're the same, cousin." Omari immediately dismissed it, laughing it off, telling him he was out of line. "You are my blood. I can't do such with you," Omari muttered, standing up. But Tyreek was ready for his excuses. He leaned forward and said something that would stay with Omari for years to come. "You preach the Bible every Sunday. Have you read it? In the days of old, cousins married cousins, family stayed with family. It's only a sin because you let them tell you it is." Omari stormed off that night. He told himself he would never speak of it again. But that wasn't what happened. Hours after the bonfire ended, Omari found himself standing outside Tyreek's hotel room. A knock. A long pause. Then the door opened. What happened inside that room became the first of many nights. Omari told himself it was a mistake, he would pray, he would repent, he would push it from his mind. But Tyreek wouldn't let him. Over the years, what started as one night of weakness turned into a carefully hidden affair. Omari scheduled church retreats where he and Tyreek would meet behind closed doors. He arranged one-on-one counseling sessions, disguised as spiritual guidance. No one suspected a thing. To his congregation, he was a man of God. To his wife, he was a devoted husband. To Tyreek, he was a man trapped in his own lies. For 6 years, their relationship was buried under secrecy, but secrets never stay hidden forever. Because what started as a dangerous temptation would end in bloodshed. By June 2023, something was different about Pastor Omari Mayfield. His sermons, once fiery, commanding, and full of conviction, had become dull, lifeless, mechanical. The congregation whispered. Where was the power? Where was the anointing? For years, he had preached against sin, temptation, and the importance of righteousness, but now, his voice lacked authority. It was as if God had left him. His eyes rarely met the crowd. His prayers felt empty, forced. Something was weighing on him. Something was pulling him away from the presence of God. And Imani Mayfield saw it too. Her husband was not the same man. He was distracted, distant, restless. Long nights in his study. Early morning drives with no explanation. Phone calls he took in whispers. She had prayed for their marriage, asking God to bring him back to her, to fix whatever had broken inside of him. But prayers wouldn't fix this. Because what Omari was hiding couldn't be prayed away. And one night, she found out the truth. It was past 2 a.m. when Omari walked into the house. Reeking of cologne that wasn't his, she knew. Imani lay in bed, eyes shut, breathing steady, pretending to be asleep. She heard his footsteps pause in the doorway, felt him stand there for a moment as if debating whether to speak. Then, he sighed and walked into the bathroom. The second the door shut, she turned over and reached for his phone. For months, something inside her had whispered check it. That night, she finally listened. The screen was unlocked. A mistake he never made. And just like that, the truth was in her hands. Messages. Pictures. Texts from Tyreek Simmons. His cousin. His own blood. Imani's breath caught in her throat as her hands scrolled through the messages. You miss me, baby. Last night felt different, you sure you still want to do this? I can still taste you, Omari. She stopped breathing. Her fingers trembled as she tapped on a photo. A picture of Omari and Tyreek together. In bed. Bare skin. No doubt. Her hands clenched the phone so tight her knuckles turned white. She stared at the image, willing it to change, to be something else. But it wasn't. She sat there, cold, still, numb. And then she waited. She waited for Omari to walk out of that bathroom. She waited for the moment she would shatter his world the way he had just shattered hers. The bathroom door opened. Omari froze the second he saw her sitting up, his phone in her hands. Her eyes, sharp and unforgiving, met his. "What is this?" A long silence. "What is this, Omari?" He didn't answer. "Say something." Still, nothing. Then, his mouth opened. "I can explain." Imani laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "Explain." She stood up, stepped toward him, threw the phone at his chest. "You swore before God. You swore before me. And this is what you've been doing. With your own cousin." Omari's legs buckled. He tried to reach for her, but she stepped back like he was something diseased. It was a mistake. A mistake. It was a moment of weakness. A test from God. Weakness? Imani's voice cracked. 6 years. 6 years, Omari. His eyes watered. "I didn't mean for it to happen. You're a liar. You meant for every single time." She turned away. Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone. "Who are you calling?" "Your mother." Omari stumbled forward. "No, Imani, please." But it was too late. The call was already ringing. Regina Mayfield was not just his mother. She was the matriarch of the family. A woman who had raised 4 children under the strict rule of faith and obedience. Her word was final. When Imani called, she didn't hesitate. Regina arrived at their home before the sun had even risen, demanding the truth straight from Omari's mouth. "Tell me it isn't true." But Omari couldn't. Regina closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, then exhaled slow. She opened them again, and her expression was stone. And then, she gave her verdict. "You end this. Now. Or I will end it for you." Her voice left no room for argument. "If you don't cut ties with that boy, I will tell the church elders myself." Omari's knees nearly gave out. His mother wasn't bluffing. This was his final warning. And he would have listened. He would have walked away. But Tyreek wasn't going to let him go. The call came that night. "You really thought you could just throw me away?" Omari closed his eyes, his hand gripping the phone so tight his nails dug into his palm. "It's over, Tyreek." "Over?" Tyreek laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You are so damn weak." Omari said nothing. "You lied to me. You used me. And now you want to run back to your wife, like none of this happened. It's done, Tyreek. Let it go. Let it go." The mockery in Tyreek's voice faded. "I don't think so, cousin." Omari's heart started to race. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't care what your mama says. I don't care what your church says. You're not gonna keep hiding me like I never mattered. Tyreek. If you won't tell them the truth, I will." And the line went dead. A meeting was set for July 8, 2023. A private family discussion. Just Regina, Imani, and Tyreek. No one else. Not even Omari's father. This meeting would decide whether Omari's secret would stay within the family or be exposed to the world. If he lost control of the narrative, he lost everything. His church. His reputation. His family. His life. This meeting wasn't about finding peace. It was about who would still be standing when it was over. The family intervention on July 8, 2023, was supposed to be a reckoning, a final attempt to contain a secret that had spiraled out of control. Regina demanded repentance. Imani demanded honesty. Tyreek demanded the truth be told, no matter the cost. Omari Mayfield walked into that meeting knowing his life would never be the same. But by the time the night was over, 3 people lay dead. The silence of the early morning was broken by the sound of gunfire and a single piercing scream. A neighbor, awoken by the chaos, reached for her phone. Her voice was shaky as she spoke to the dispatcher. "I heard something, gunshots. Screaming. It came from the Mayfield's house. Oh my God, something's wrong." The call happened at 3:17 a.m. Within minutes, Birmingham police arrived at the house, a 2-story brick house that now stood eerily still. The front door was unlocked. The lights inside were on, but no movement. Officers entered, weapons drawn. And what they found inside would send shockwaves through the entire community. 3 bodies. 3 rooms. 3 different ways to die. This was not a spontaneous act of violence. This was controlled. Intentional. Personal. Regina Mayfield, mother. Found seated in the living room, her hands clutching a Bible, her eyes still open in horror. A single gunshot wound to the head, execution style, the bullet lodged deep into her skull. The Bible on her lap was stained with blood, its pages open to Leviticus 20 verse 13, the verse condemning homosexuality. 1 shot. 1 final judgment. Tyreek Simmons, cousin and lover. The smell of iron and bleach led officers down the hall to the bathroom. Blood coated the white tile floors, smeared across the walls in thick, violent streaks. 10 stab wounds, 5 to the chest, 3 to the abdomen, 2 to the throat. Defensive wounds on his forearms and hands. Tyreek had fought back. His eyes were still open, his mouth slightly parted, as if he had died mid-scream. This wasn't just a killing. This was rage. Imani Mayfield, wife. The garage door was slightly open, a cold draft sweeping through the space. Imani's body was on the floor, one hand resting against the side of her car, her face frozen in terror. A long electrical cord was wrapped around her throat, deep bruising evident where the wire had dug into her skin. Her wedding ring was missing, a final insult. This wasn't just murder. This was punishment. The house was too clean. Too precise. Someone had staged this crime scene before they left. And that someone was missing. The evidence that told a story. No forced entry. The door was unlocked. No signs of struggle or forced access. Whoever did this was let in willingly. Tyreek's phone, the blackmail evidence. Recovered near his body, soaked in blood. Detectives extracted messages between Tyreek and Omari. One message stood out, sent hours before his death. "Either you tell them, or I will." Blood on Omari's clothes, but no Omari. A small pile of clothes was found in the bathroom hamper, damp with blood splatter. A pair of shoes, partially cleaned, still had traces of blood in the grooves of the soles. Omari's wallet, watch, and car keys were gone. He had left in a hurry. But he had also tried to cover his tracks. Omari Mayfield had one motive: silence the people who could ruin him. But the truth doesn't die so easily. And neither does justice. Bottom of Formby. The time first responders arrived, Omari Mayfield was nowhere to be found. The house was a scene of devastation, but it was also carefully staged. Something about it felt too perfect, too controlled. And the investigators were about to uncover a truth far worse than they expected. Detectives immediately turned to nearby security cameras. At 3:09 a.m., exactly 8 minutes before the 911 call, Omari's white Chevrolet Tahoe was captured leaving the Mayfield residence, speeding down. He wasn't rushing away in panic. He wasn't frantic or erratic. He was calm, calculated, like a man who had just finished what he came to do. And just like that, he vanished into the night. Detectives retrieved Tyreek's phone, which was soaked in blood but still operational. They pulled the last conversation between Omari and Tyreek, exchanged just hours before the murders. "They know, Omari. You can't stop this now. You don't understand what you're doing. You're going to ruin everything, me, my family and church. You already ruined yourself. I'm done protecting you, Omari. Either you accept this relationship or face me. I don't care about your mom's decision or the church or family knowing, don't do this. Omari said, watch me. Tyreek last message. The last text was never responded to. By 3:09 a.m., Tyreek was dead. And Omari was gone. Autopsy reports, how they died. 3 deaths. 3 different forms of punishment. Regina Mayfield, execution. 1 bullet to the head. Close range. No struggle. The Bible found near her body was open to Leviticus 20 verse 13, the passage condemning gay. It was not a message to her, it was a message to himself. Tyreek Simmons, overkill. Stabbed 10 times. 5 to the chest. 3 to the stomach. 2 to the throat. Defensive wounds on his forearms. He fought back. Deepest wounds were in the heart. This wasn't just murder. This was rage. Betrayal. Revenge. Imani Mayfield, the personal kill. Strangled with an electrical cord. The deep bruising suggested a slow, deliberate act. Her wedding ring was missing, an act of erasing her presence from his life. This was not a quick death. It was a message. A punishment. Each murder told a story. Each act was intentional. And there was only one person who had a reason to commit them all. Omari Deshaun Mayfield wasn't just a suspect. He was the only suspect. And now, it was time to find him. For 3 days, authorities searched for Omari Deshaun Mayfield. His face was plastered the community, his church in shock as the truth unraveled. The man who once stood at the pulpit, preaching about righteousness and salvation, was now wanted. And he was gone. No trace. No credit card activity. No car. No sign of where he could have disappeared. But he was out there. And he was running. Authorities tracked his last known phone signal. It pinged near Atlanta, Georgia, then went silent. Omari traveled from Texas to Atlanta in an attempt to escape and disappear. Gas station footage from a small town in Georgia captured a man wearing a hoodie, his face partially obscured by the brim of a baseball cap. He paid in cash, avoiding ATMs or anything that could lead them to him. But the mistake came when he checked into a cheap roadside motel. He used a fake name, David Lawson. But he didn't know that the motel clerk recognized him from a WhatsApp group chat about a pastor on the run. A call was placed to Atlanta PD. Within minutes, officers surrounded the motel. Room 206. A single knock. Atlanta PD opened the door. Silence. Then, footsteps. A pause. The sound of a drawer opening. They kicked the door in. And there he was. Sitting on the edge of the bed, hands clasped together, eyes staring at the floor. No fight. No struggle. No escape attempt. His bag was packed, but he hadn't left yet. He knew his time was up. Stand up, Omari. Hands where we can see them. He obeyed. And just like that, his run was over. In the cold, gray walls of the interrogation room, Omari sat across from 2 homicide detectives, his wrists shackled to the steel table. His face was hollow, his once carefully maintained beard now uneven, his eyes bloodshot from nights without sleep. A far cry from the polished pastor who once commanded a pulpit. The room was silent as the lead detective dropped. Your mother was shot at close range. No forced entry. No robbery. Just a bullet in the head. Who else but you had a reason to do this? Omari's jaw clenched. His fingers twitched. I don't know what happened. This is a setup. The devil is testing me. The detective didn't react. He pulled out another photograph. Tyreek. Stab wounds covering his chest, abdomen, and throat. Blood everywhere. Tell me why your cousin is dead in your house. Tell me why his phone had texts of you telling him not to say anything. Omari didn't speak. Another photo hit the table. Imani. Bruises on her neck. Eyes frozen open. Your wife didn't even fight back. You strangled her slowly. Why, Omari? His breath hitched. The silence grew heavier. Then, the detective pulled out one final piece of evidence. A printed screenshot of a text conversation from Regina Mayfield to Omari, just hours before she was killed. Regina, 6:42 p.m., you have until Sunday to confess. If you don't, I will. Omari stared at the paper, his body tense, his breathing shallow. And then, he broke. His head dropped into his hands. His shoulders shook. His voice was low, hollow, drained of life. If they couldn't let me live, why should they? A heavy silence filled the room. What did you just say? Omari slowly lifted his bloodshot eyes to meet the detective's. I had no choice. You always had a choice. The detective leaned forward. Why did you kill them, Omari? You could have accepted who you are. Omari's lip quivered, but his voice came out flat. Emotionless. Final. My life was over the second they found out. With that, the interrogation was over. Omari Mayfield had nothing left to say. And now, justice would decide his fate. The courtroom was packed. Every seat taken. Reporters lined the back, cameras rolling, capturing the downfall of Pastor Omari Mayfield, a man who once stood behind a pulpit, now seated in a defendant's chair, shackled at the wrists. For weeks, the case had dominated headlines, splitting public opinion. Some called him a murderer consumed by his own deception. Others saw him as a man broken by the weight of religious pressure. But when the trial began, the evidence spoke louder than any sermon he had ever preached. The case against Omari. He killed to silence the truth. DNA, surveillance footage, deleted texts, and Tyreek's phone records, it all led back to him. He staged the crime scene, wiped away evidence, and fled across state lines. This was not a crime of passion, this was a calculated attempt to erase everyone who could expose him. He murdered his own mother, his cousin, and his wife, not because they wronged him, but because they knew the truth. A truth he was willing to kill for. The witness testimonies. A church deacon took the stand. He was always preaching against homosexuality, he just did it well. The more he condemned it, the more I wondered if he was running from something. A neighbor testified about the gunshots and screams at 3:17 a.m. A forensic expert detailed how each victim was murdered differently, each death reflecting a deliberate and personal motive. The prosecution delivered its final blow, showing the final texts between Omari and Tyreek. If you won't tell them, I will. Don't do this. Watch me. Minutes later, Tyreek was dead. This was premeditated murder. Omari's lawyers had little to work with. So they tried to shift the blame. They argued temporary insanity, a man raised in strict religious doctrine, forced to live a lie, pushed to the edge. They painted him as a victim, a man who spent his life hiding, trapped between faith and identity. A psychologist testified, calling Omari a narcissist who saw exposure as a fate worse than death. But the prosecution was ready. What about his mother? Did she deserve to die for wanting the truth? What about his wife? Did she deserve to be strangled for asking for honesty? What about his cousin? Was he nothing more than an inconvenience? Omari never looked up. His head hung low, hands trembling, as the jury watched his every move. When the closing arguments ended, the jury was sent to deliberate. 9 hours later, they returned. The judge asked for silence. The foreman stood. On the charge of first-degree murder of Regina Mayfield, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder of Tyreek Simmons, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder of Imani Mayfield, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. The courtroom erupted, gasps, whispers, sobs from the victim's family. Omari did not react. His face was vacant, lifeless. The defendant is hereby sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He will serve his sentence at ADX Florence, the most secure federal prison in the United States. The gavel slammed. It was over. Omari would never walk free again. Omari Mayfield was no longer a pastor. His church was permanently closed, its doors locked, its congregation scattered. The case sparked national debates, forcing religious institutions to confront deep-rooted hypocrisy and the dangers of repression. But questions remained. Did anyone in his church know the truth? Were there other lovers Omari had hidden over the years? Had Tyreek threatened to expose Omari before? The world had its answers. But the full truth? That was buried with the dead. Omari Mayfield spent his life preaching against sin while living in it. He built a false image, convinced that hiding his truth would save him. But in the end, his fear of exposure led to murder. Now, his name is no longer spoken in reverence. It is remembered for one thing only, the man who killed to protect a secret. Was it worth it? Was it worth 3 lives? Was it worth the pain, the destruction, the loss? Would you kill to keep your secret? Or would you rather live in truth, no matter the cost? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.